A frantic message from the future screams through the silence. The paradox is not a theory, it is a weapon. They are coming for the cradle. Dr. Aris Thorne at the Temporal Research Institute receives this encrypted transmission, a ghost from a tomorrow that should not exist. It is a warning that shatters every assumption about time travel, revealing it not as a tool for discovery, but as a trigger for an unseen war. By the end of this story, you will understand the terrifying, permanent reason why humanity is forbidden from ever touching time. Who are the mysterious figures hunting us from the future, and what horrifying secret connects them to our own potential? What would you sacrifice to protect the entire timeline from your own ambition? General Kalen's voice was a wall of absolute certainty, a stark contrast to the frantic ghost in the machine. He stood in the control center, a mountain of medals and resolve, dismissing the encrypted scream as meaningless noise. "We are on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history, Doctor," he declared, his eyes fixed on the main display where their first manned chronal probe was being prepared. "I will not be swayed by ghosts." For Aris Thorne, those words were not just a refusal, they were a death sentence for reason. This was the core conflict laid bare, the collision between scientific caution and raw, unchecked ambition. The general saw a tool for ultimate power, a way to rewrite history to his liking. Aris saw a loaded weapon pointed at the heart of existence itself. With every official channel now closed to her, with the countdown to the first test ignition ticking away on the screens, she had no choice left. She had to take matters into her own hands. The fate of the timeline now rested not on official protocols, but on the desperate, secret actions of one terrified scientist. The prototype temporal scanner hummed with a forbidden energy in the dim light of Aris' private lab. She had bypassed 3 security protocols to activate it, her hands trembling not from fear of reprimand, but from the terrifying data now painting the main holoscreen. A single, sharp energy signature, unlike anything in their own experiments, was being broadcast. It wasn't a random fluctuation. It was a precise, calculated signal originating from a future date and aimed like a spear at one specific point in their own timeline. Aris traced its trajectory, her blood running cold as the coordinates resolved. The target was the day of the first successful time travel experiment, the very event General Kalen was about to trigger. The ghost in the machine had not been a plea for help. It was a marker, a flare shot into the past to illuminate a target for an unseen enemy. This was not a message, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It is a targeting beacon, every assumption shattered at once. The future wasn't just sending warnings, it was actively hunting. Someone or something was using the very fabric of time as a conduit for an attack, aiming to destroy the moment time travel itself was born. Her clandestine act of defiance had just uncovered an invasion in its final stages. The race was no longer about convincing a stubborn general. It was about stopping an assault on the foundation of their reality, an assault that was already locked and loaded, counting down to 0. The scanner's feed flickered violently, the ghostly image on the holoscreen refusing to stabilize. It was a silhouette but wrong, a form that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Clad in armor that flowed like liquid shadow, the figure moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, as if it were skipping through frames of reality itself. A young technician, his face pale in the screen's glow, choked out a name that would forever haunt the halls of the Institute, the Chronovores. His voice was a terrified whisper. "They do not just travel through time, Doctor, they consume it." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. This was the enemy, not a rival civilization, not a future version of humanity, but something fundamentally other, something whose very existence was a violation of natural law. They were not using time as a road, they were treating it as a meal. Imagine a creature that does not just walk through a forest, but devours the very path it walks on, leaving only a void behind it. That is what a chronovore is. Every moment they inhabit is erased, digested into whatever fuels their impossible existence. The frantic warning from the future, the targeting beacon aimed at their experiment, it all snapped into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture. General Kalen was not just risking a paradox, he was preparing a feast, and he was inviting the diners to the table. The first manned probe was not a step into the future. It was the dinner bell. The countdown hit 0. A low hum filled the control center, building into a deafening roar as the temporal chamber ignited. Aris slammed her hand on the emergency abort panel. System overridden, a flat, computerized voice announced. General Kalen stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of absolute conviction. On the main display, Major Valerius gave a final, confident nod before the light inside the chamber flared, swallowing him whole. For a single, breathless second, there was only silence. Then the entire facility convulsed. The floor bucked like a living thing, throwing technicians from their chairs. Alarms shrieked, a chorus of pure panic. The energy surge did not come from the probe's outgoing trajectory. It erupted from inside the chamber itself, a violent backlash of raw temporal force that shattered the primary containment field. The test was not a success. It was a trap sprung the instant the first human consciousness pierced the time stream. The Chronovores had not just been waiting. They had baited the hook, and General Kalen had led them all right to it. The danger was no longer a theoretical warning on a screen. It was here, ripping their reality apart from the inside out. Emergency lights bathed the control center in a hellish red glow. The main holoscreen, now a mosaic of global news feeds, showed a world coming undone. In Cairo, the Great Pyramids of Giza flickered, their ancient stone blocks dissolving into shimmering dust for a heart-stopping second before snapping back into existence not as limestone, but as impossible, glittering crystalline spires that pierced the smog-filled sky. In Rome, news anchors stammered in confusion as the Colosseum seemed to ripple, its familiar arches momentarily replaced by the smooth, alien curves of a structure no human hand had ever designed. It was not an attack on a single city or nation. It was an assault on memory itself, on the very bedrock of what had happened. "They are not just breaking the rules," Aris whispered, her voice lost in the cacophony of the collapsing timeline. "They are rewriting the rulebook in real time." The Chronovores were not simply consuming time. They were editing it, cutting humanity out of the picture and pasting in a new, horrifying reality where we had never existed. With every flicker, with every change, another piece of our shared history was being erased, another thread of causality snipped away. The fabric of human achievement was unraveling before their eyes, and they were watching the loose ends burn. How do you fight an enemy that can simply delete your victories from existence? The war for the future had just become a desperate battle for the past. Sirens wailed through the corridors, their sound a physical force pushing her forward. Aris Thorne moved not as a scientist now, but as prey, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The lockdown order had named her directly, a rogue agent guilty of treason for trying to stop the cataclysm they had just unleashed. Her security clearance was a ghost in the system, her identity an active target. She ducked into a service elevator, pressing the coordinator drive from the prototype scanner hard against her chest. It was the only evidence she had left, a digital ghost screaming the truth that General Kalen had refused to hear. The world outside was flickering in and out of existence, and the only person who understood why was now being hunted by the very people she was trying to save. This was the ultimate isolation, carrying the burden of a truth that could rewrite reality, while being branded a liar by a reality that was crumbling. Her escape was a blur of stolen keycards and shadowed maintenance ducts, each step a betrayal of the life she had built. She emerged not into the crisp mountain air she remembered, but into a cityscape that was wrong. The familiar skyline of the research campus was shifting. the buildings momentarily replaced by jagged, obsidian monoliths that scraped a violet-tinged sky before snapping back to concrete and steel. The air itself tasted different, charged with ozone and the scent of rust. She was a fugitive in two worlds now, hunted by her own kind in a present that was actively being unmade. How do you convince someone the house is on fire when the flames keep vanishing the moment they look? Her mission was no longer about delivering proof to a committee. It was a solo, desperate race against an enemy that was erasing the very ground she stood on, with the only weapon being a truth that was becoming less real with every passing second. The air in the museum tasted of rust and ozone, a metallic tang that coated her tongue. Aris pressed her back against a shattered display case, its contents a nonsensical fusion of a Viking longship's prow and a fiber optic cable. The world outside groaned, the floor tilting as another wave of temporal distortion washed over the building. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the grand hall, closing in. They were here, she was trapped, the data drive a cold, hard weight in her palm, its truth now useless. A shadow fell over her, not from the doorway ahead, but from the side. She braced for the end, then he was just there, a man who hadn't been a moment before, moving with a fluid grace that made the Chronovore's jerky motions seem clumsy. He moved like water flowing around stones, a blur of worn leather and calm intensity. In one smooth motion, he grabbed her arm and pulled her sideways, not through a door, but into the narrow space between two trembling exhibits. A display of Renaissance paintings flickered, the Mona Lisa's smile twisting into a silent scream before stabilizing. The hunters passed them by, their helmeted heads never turning, their perception somehow missing the two people hiding in plain sight. "My name is Leo," the man whispered, his voice low and etched with a weary patience that felt ancient. "And you, Doctor, are trying to play chess with a storm." He led her through a service corridor that shouldn't have existed, a pocket of stable space in the crumbling museum. "You cannot fight them head-on," he stated, his eyes holding a universe of witnessed failures. "Their perception is not linear like yours. They do not see one moment after another. They see all potential moments at once, a tangled web of what was, what is, and what might be. To them, your attack is already a memory, and your defense is a future they can simply step around." Aris stared, the implications sinking in. How do you defeat an enemy that experiences your entire strategy from birth to execution in a single glance? Leo's mouth formed a thin, grim line. "You do not use force, you use confusion. You have to think in paradoxes. You must become a question they cannot answer." He was a temporal drifter, he explained, a relic of a black-budget time program the government had buried decades ago. His team had been the first to pierce the veil, and they had been the first to see the feeding shadows on the other side. Their program was scrubbed, the records destroyed, the personnel scattered or silenced. He was the only one who hadn't come back, not properly. His own timeline had been severed, leaving him unstuck, a permanent ghost in the machine. He existed in the cracks, watching as the careless ambitions of a new generation repeated the same catastrophic mistakes. "I have seen this before, Doctor," he said, his gaze drifting to a wall that momentarily became transparent, showing a city of crystal and fire. "The outcome is always the same, unless we break the rules they have written for this game." Leo's words landed not as a revelation, but as a deep, resonating dread that had been waiting its turn. "Humanity did master time travel," he repeated, his voice stripped of all pride. "Not just in this timeline. We have cracked the code again and again across countless branching realities. Each time we celebrated, each time we reached for the ultimate power, and every single time," he said, his hollow tone carving a grave for all of human ambition, "we become them. The hunger for temporal energy, for absolute control over cause and effect, it corrupts without exception. The Chronovores are not an alien invasion. They are what we become. The enemy hunting us, the entity erasing our history, is a future, corrupted version of ourselves. The frantic warning from the future was not a plea from an ally. It was a last desperate scream from the last shred of our own dying humanity, a final flicker of who we were before the hunger consumed everything. This redefined everything. This was not a war against an external foe. It was a civil war waged across the ages, a battle against the monstrous, inevitable outcome of our own ambition. The paradox was not a weapon we could disarm. It was a cancer woven into our very nature, triggered the moment we touched time. How do you fight a future you are destined to create? You cannot outsmart it because it already knows every move you will ever make. You cannot destroy it because in doing so, you would only cement the path that leads to its creation. The conflict was a perfect, inescapable loop. Leo had not come to help her win a war. He had come to show her that the war itself was the problem. The only way to break the cycle was to do the one thing humanity, in all its iterations, had never been able to do. "We have to surrender," he whispered, the words sounding like blasphemy. "We have to choose to lose. We must let time travel die in its cradle forever." Surrender was not a retreat, it was a strategy. Leo's gaze was fixed on a point in the air, a place only he could see. To fight a war across time, you do not need a bigger army. You need an anchor, a single, fixed point in the timeline, an event so massive, so resilient that its causality echoes forward and backward, creating a foundation the Chronovores cannot easily consume. He finally looked at her, and the weight of centuries was in his eyes. "I believe the anchor we need is the very research General Kalen is about to complete. The paradox of its creation is the only thing strong enough to stabilize this reality." Aris felt a cold clarity wash over her. "Kalen is playing right into their hands," Leo stated, his voice flat and certain. "He thinks completing the experiment will save us, that it will give us the power to fight back, but he is wrong. That final, successful ignition is not our victory. It is the final step in our transformation into them. It is the moment our potential to become Chronovores becomes an unchangeable fact. Every calculation, every desperate attempt to use time travel to undo this mess only tightens the noose." The objective was now terrifyingly simple and utterly desperate. They could not win this war. The only way to break the cycle was to ensure the war never happened. They had to stop the experiment, not to save their present, but to annihilate that specific, monstrous future. They had to sabotage the very discovery that promised to save them, and in doing so, sacrifice all that power to protect the simple, fragile timeline they had always known. Could they truly sever humanity's destiny by destroying its greatest ambition? The Institute was a fortress under siege by its own commander. Leo moved with an unnerving silence, guiding Aris through maintenance corridors that hummed with an energy they were never designed to carry. He navigated not by sight but by a deeper sense, slipping through temporal blind spots, fleeting pockets where reality was still thick and the Chronovores' all-seeing gaze grew fuzzy. They emerged onto a high gantry overlooking the main control center, and the sight below stole the air from Aris' lungs. General Kalen stood before a massive holographic war map, but it was not a map of nations. It was a tapestry of history itself, with glowing threads representing centuries of human events. He was not planning a defense, he was planning an eradication. His voice, amplified and cold, echoed through the chamber. "We will hit them before they evolve. We will excise their entire timeline from existence." He was pointing at the branching path that represented the Chronovores' own origin. Aris felt a cold dread crystallize in her chest. He is using their own tactics. He was no longer trying to save their present. He was preparing to commit temporal genocide, to rewrite the past in a way that would prevent his enemy's future, no matter the cost to the delicate web of cause and effect. The power was already corrupting him, blurring the line between the man and the monster he sought to destroy. He stood there, drenched in the cold light of the hologram, and she could see the same hunger in his eyes that Leo had described, the same absolute conviction that he alone could wield the scalpel on time itself. He was becoming the very thing he was fighting, and he did not even see it. How close is the line between savior and destroyer when you hold the power to erase your enemies from history itself? The mission was no longer just about stopping a machine. It was about stopping a man from making the most catastrophic decision in human history, a decision that would forever stain our past with the blood of a future he deemed unworthy. The air in the control center crackled, thick with the scent of ozone and unchecked ambition. Aris stepped out of the shadowed gantry, her heart hammering against her ribs. General Kalen stood bathed in the cold light of the holographic war map, but he was no longer just a man. A faint, shimmering aura clung to him like a heat haze, distorting the air around his shoulders. It was the same liquid shadow she had seen in the Chronovore's form, a ghostly echo of the monster he was on the verge of becoming. "You have to stop this, Kalen," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of machinery. "You are not saving us, you are damning us." He turned, and his eyes held a terrifying, fractured light. "You see only destruction, Aris," he said, his voice echoing slightly, as if spoken from the far end of a long tunnel. "I see evolution. Why be a footnote in history when we can be its authors?" The question hung in the air, a perfect summary of his corruption. He no longer saw himself as a protector of humanity, but as its sculptor, willing to shatter the original masterpiece to create a new one in his own image. This was the point of no return. The general was gone, replaced by a nascent godling drunk on a power he could not possibly control. He believed he was writing the future, but he was merely reading from a script written by the very enemies he sought to destroy. In his desperate quest for control, he had become a puppet, and the strings were being pulled by the future version of himself. How do you reason with a man who believes his own descent into monstrosity is a promotion? The confrontation was over before it began. He was already lost, and the only path left was through him. The incursion weapon flared to life, its hum escalating into a shriek that felt like it was tearing the air molecules apart. General Kalen stood at the epicenter, arms raised, his form now a near-perfect silhouette of liquid darkness. He was a gateway, and through him, Aris could see the warped geometry of a dying future reaching back to consume its own birth. Leo did not move to attack him. He did not even look at the weapon. Instead, he closed his eyes, and a faint golden light began to bleed from his own skin, a stark contrast to the devouring blackness radiating from the general. He wasn't fighting the power, he was joining it, weaving his own frayed timeline directly into the machine's core. The recursive loop formed not with a bang, but with a silent, profound snap. One moment, Kalen was a god of annihilation, poised to rewrite history. The next, he was frozen, trapped in a single, repeating second of his own triumph. His face was locked in a rictus of victory, his command to fire eternally on his lips, forever a heartbeat from being spoken. The weapon's energy, with no outlet, swirled back in on itself, a brilliant, contained star of paradox. Leo collapsed, the last of his borrowed time spent. A prison of his own ambition, he gasped, his body flickering like a dying candle. He had not destroyed the machine or the man. He had simply turned their greatest strength into an inescapable cage. Kalen had wanted to control time, and now he would experience a single, perfect moment of it for all eternity. The solution was not force, but a flawless, logical trap. How do you defeat a being that sees all of time? You give it a single, perfect moment to look at, over and over again, until the end of time itself. The immediate threat was contained, but the cost was a man's sacrifice to save the very timeline that had cast him out. Silence returned to the control center, a profound and heavy quiet broken only by the low, persistent hum of the stabilized paradox. On the main display, the chaotic flickering of a rewritten world began to slow. The crystalline spires over Cairo dissolved back into ancient, weathered limestone. The alien curves of the Colosseum smoothed once more into familiar Roman arches. It was like watching a wound heal in reverse, the timeline stitching itself back together, moment by moment, as the recursive loop containing Kalen acted as a dam against the flood of changes. The immediate fire was out, but the air grew colder and the hum of the machinery began to pitch upward into a new, more frantic frequency. Through the main viewing portal, the swirling colors of the time stream itself began to darken. At first, it was just a shadow, then another, and then hundreds of them. They coalesced like ink dropped into water, their liquid shadow forms blotting out the light of causality itself. The energy released by creating a perfect, self-contained paradox had not gone unnoticed. It was a bonfire in the darkness, a signal flare of impossible power, and every chronovore in the vicinity was now swimming toward the light. They were not attacking yet, they were gathering, a silent, observing swarm just outside the bubble of Leo's prison, drawn to the single greatest concentration of temporal energy ever created. "We did not win," Aris whispered, the truth a cold stone in her stomach. "We just laid out a feast. The anchor had held, saving the past, but in doing so, it had announced their location to every predator in the time stream." How long could a single, brilliant trap hold back an entire hungry ocean? Leo's breathing was a ragged, shallow sound, a stark contrast to the cold hum of the machine. He did not look at the gathering swarm outside the portal. His gaze was fixed on Aris, and in his eyes she saw a terrible, final peace. "They will break through," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The paradox is a dam, but the ocean is infinite. It will not hold them for long. When it shatters, the backlash will complete what Kalen started. This timeline will be consumed, and we will become them." "There is no winning this battle, Aris. The only victory is to ensure the war never happens again." His hand trembled as he pressed a small, crystalline device into her palm. It felt inert, like a smooth, cold stone. "This is a causal charge," he explained. "It does not destroy matter or energy. It targets the underlying laws of physics themselves. When you detonate this at the heart of the temporal core, it will not create an explosion. It will create a new universal constant. It will make time travel a mathematical impossibility for our species. Forever, the weight of the object in her hand was nothing compared to the weight of his words. He was not giving her a weapon. He was giving her a scalpel to perform surgery on reality itself, to remove the part of the human mind that had dreamed of touching time. He was asking her to cure the disease by amputating the very idea of the cure. "I will hold them here," he said, turning to face the darkening swarm. "I will be the final piece of the paradox, the lure that keeps their attention while you finish this." Go. His sacrifice was not an act of violence, but one of perfect, heartbreaking logic. He was a man whose own timeline was already shredded, a ghost with nothing left to lose but the future of everyone else. He would use the last moments of his existence to become a question the Chronovores could not ignore, a puzzle of a man trapping himself in a cage he had already built, just to buy her the seconds she needed to save a world that would never know his name. Could any victory be worth a silence so absolute, a future so deliberately limited? Aris turned and ran, the cold crystal of the charge biting into her hand, not toward a new dawn, but toward a permanent, necessary twilight for human ambition. The corridor to the temporal core stretched like a throat, its walls pulsing with a sick, arrhythmic light. Aris ran, her lungs burning, the causal charge of frozen brand against her palm. The air itself was thickening, resisting her, as if reality knew she carried its death warrant. Then the walls began to bleed shadows. They did not simply appear, they condensed from the air, their liquid dark forms gaining substance with every step she took. Their movements were less of a predatory stalk now and more of a terrible, familiar stride, and in the shifting masses of their not faces she saw it. A flicker of a strong jawline, the ghost of a determined brow. General Kalen's face mirrored in a dozen advancing forms. They were not just hunting her. They were showing her their origin, revealing the horrifying truth of their creation. These were not aliens, they were the future, the inevitable end result of Kalen's ambition, reaching back to ensure their own birth. The horror of it was a physical blow. She was not just fighting monsters, she was fighting a destiny, a self-fulfilling prophecy made flesh. Her own potential future was advancing on her, its features hardening out of the chaos, and the only way to stop it was to destroy the very power that had given it life. Her final sprint became a desperate flight from a tomorrow that was already here, her own breath a ragged counterpoint to the silent, certain advance of what humanity was doomed to become. Her hand slammed the crystalline charge into the reactor's core. There was no explosion, no blinding flash of light. Instead, a wave of absolute silence expanded outward, swallowing the shrieking hum of the machinery and the advancing footsteps of the future. It was a sound more profound than any noise, a void that consumed everything in its path. The Chronovores did not scream or flee. As the wave touched them, they simply unraveled. Their liquid shadow forms dissolved not into dust, but into a faint gray static, their complex predatory timelines snipped away like loose threads. They were not being destroyed in the conventional sense. They were being rendered impossible, their very existence erased from the book of physical law. The complex set of conditions, the delicate equations that had once allowed a human mind to pierce the veil of time, were being rewritten at a fundamental level. The universe was patching its own vulnerability, closing a door that should never have been opened. The cost of this salvation was the permanent loss of the technology itself. Time travel was not just forbidden now, it was made obsolete, a forgotten dream locked away by the new, unbreakable rules of reality. The grand, terrible ambition that had defined their research, that had promised godhood and delivered only monsters, was now nothing more than a mathematical error corrected for all eternity. Could humanity truly be content with a single, linear path, knowing what wonders and horrors it had sacrificed to survive? The silence that remained was not just the absence of sound. It was the sound of a door closing forever, a final, definitive answer to a question we should never have asked. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. No sirens, no groaning metal, no frantic shouts, just the distant, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the soft rustle of a nurse adjusting a curtain. Aris Thorne opened her eyes to the sterile white of a hospital room, the world outside her window holding a sky of impossible, ordinary blue. The air smelled of antiseptic, not ozone. It was a world that had never known the taste of rust. A television mounted on the wall showed a documentary about ancient Egypt, the pyramids standing as they always had, made of simple, weathered stone. There were no crystalline spires, no flickering. The timeline had healed itself, stitching the wound so perfectly there was not even a scar. Her release papers listed her admission as the result of a severe collapse from overwork at the Theoretical Physics Museum, the place where she was a senior researcher. The Temporal Research Institute did not exist in any database. It was a museum now, a place of quiet halls and polished displays explaining elegant equations that could never be made real. She found General Kalen's file in a declassified military archive. His portrait was there, stern and proud, but the caption beneath it was stark, listed as missing in action during a classified deep space radar calibration test over 30 years ago. He was not a monster trapped in a paradox. He was a ghost, a patriot lost to a mundane accident, his grand ambition reduced to a single, sad line in a forgotten record. The victory was absolute. The Chronovores were an impossible fiction, a nightmare erased before it could even begin. Yet the memory of them was a cold, hard stone lodged deep in her chest. She walked through the museum's main hall, past a display celebrating the centenary of Einstein's theory of relativity, and saw children pressing buttons to make light bend on a screen. They would grow up in a universe with firm, unbreakable rules, a safe, linear existence. They would never know the terror of a future that could reach back and unmake them. They would never feel the godlike temptation to rewrite a mistake, and that was the true weight of her burden. She had saved them from a glorious, terrifying destiny, trading a potential empire among the stars for the simple, profound safety of a single, unchangeable yesterday. Was it a triumph or the most profound act of surrender in human history? Every time she looked at the unbroken line of history in a textbook, she saw the ghost of the path not taken, and wondered if the cost of their survival was a cage they would never even know they were in. The polished granite floor of the museum felt cool and solid beneath her feet, a permanent anchor in a world that now knew only one direction. Aris walked through the hushed halls, past exhibits on Newtonian physics and quantum entanglement, each one a testament to a universe that played by firm, knowable rules. She stopped before a simple display titled The Grandfather Paradox, a panel of text next to a diagram of a man looking at an old photograph. The air here smelled of lemon-scented polish and quiet contemplation. A young student, his face bright with the untroubled curiosity of a linear world, pointed at the diagram. But why would it be forbidden? He asked the elderly curator. It would be so useful. Think of the good we could do. The curator, a man with kind eyes and a posture that suggested he had carried heavy things in his life, simply smiled a sad, knowing smile. His gaze drifted over the student's shoulder and met Aris's. In that silent moment, a universe of shared, impossible memory passed between them, he knew. He was one of them, another silent guardian stationed at this outpost of forgotten history. Aris felt the weight of the causal charge in her memory, not as a physical object but as a permanent scar on her soul. She looked at the boy, at his unburdened faith in utility, and she understood the profound danger of that simple question. She leaned close to the display case, her breath misting the glass, and whispered the oath that was now her identity. The words Leo had seared into her heart. Because some doors are never meant to be opened. The student shrugged and moved on, the philosophical puzzle no match for the allure of the planetarium show. Aris did not move. She had become a warden in a prison of her own making, a silent sentinel ensuring that humanity would forever gaze at the stars with wonder, but never, ever grasp the power to rearrange them. Her victory was a life sentence of remembering what everyone else was blessed to forget. Years melted into a quiet, watchful rhythm, a life lived in the soft glow of monitors. Aris Thorne existed in a secluded cabin, her only company the ceaseless flow of global data streams she tapped with protocols only she remembered. Her purpose was simple, a self-imposed penance etched into her every waking moment. She was a lighthouse keeper, scanning an ocean she prayed would remain forever empty, watching for the slightest ripple of forbidden knowledge. For the most part, the world remained blissfully, beautifully ignorant. Then she began to notice the ghosts. A brilliant postdoctoral student in Zurich, Ilara Vance, published a paper on quantum superposition that elegantly sidestepped into a theoretical model for closed time-like curves. Her work was dazzling, a near-perfect mathematical prelude to the science Aris had helped erase. 2 weeks after publishing, Ilara Vance was gone, not dead. Vanished, her apartment was empty, her digital footprint scrubbed with a chilling, professional precision. A month later, a reclusive tech billionaire known for funding radical physics experiments dropped all public communication after a cryptic tweet about rewriting personal history. He, too, disappeared from public view. The pattern was a faint, terrifying melody only Aris could hear. These were not accidents, they were excisions. She dug deeper, cross-referencing obscure academic forums, patent filings, and energy consumption reports, tracing a web of brilliant minds who had brushed against the forbidden and then simply ceased to be. The truth, when it finally clicked into place, was both a relief and a profound horror. She was not alone. There were others out there, a silent, decentralized network of guardians operating in the shadows. They were not scientists, they were librarians of a forbidden library, and their primary duty was not to lend books, but to burn any page that even hinted at the content. This was the final, necessary safeguard, a shadowy inquisition working tirelessly to protect a reality that could never know it was being protected. They did not ask questions. They did not offer warnings. When a mind grew too curious, when a theory ventured too close to the precipice, they simply edited the draft. They were the immune system of the timeline, and their methods were absolute, ruthless, and utterly necessary. Could the ultimate act of preservation ever be truly moral, or was it merely the clean, quiet violence required to maintain a fragile peace? Aris knew then that her vigil was not the end of the story, but a single node in a vast, invisible war, a war fought not for victory, but for the permanent, precious silence of a forgotten dream. The rain fell in a soft, gray curtain outside her cabin window, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her long vigil. Aris traced the lines of code on her screen, a routine scan for the faintest echo of forbidden science, when a new alert blinked into existence. It wasn't a government report or a scrubbed academic paper. It was a public post on an obscure physics forum, a cry for help masked as a theoretical puzzle. The equations were elegant, beautiful, and horrifyingly familiar. They were the precursors, the very first steps down the path she had helped erase. The username was Eva Rostova. A week later, the woman was standing on her porch, soaked and shivering, her eyes burning with a frantic, intellectual fire that Aris had not seen in decades. "You are Aris Thorne," Eva stammered, clutching a tablet to her chest like a shield. "Your early papers on quantum causality, they were the key. I know it is possible. I have the math, but every time I run the models, they glitch. The numbers twist. It is like reality itself is rejecting the idea." She thrust the tablet forward, the screen displaying a simulation of a temporal loop that stuttered and fractured, collapsing into visual static. It wasn't a software error. It was the causal charge at work, the universe's new immune system actively fighting off the infection of her idea. Aris felt a cold, familiar dread settle in her stomach. This was not a theoretical threat anymore. It was a person, a brilliant, desperate mind standing on the precipice. Eva represented a critical failure of the silent guardian system. They had missed her, and now the contamination was knocking at her door. The old protocol was clear and ruthless: a car accident, a data wipe, a sudden, tragic illness that would end the research and bury the knowledge. It was the clean, quiet violence that had maintained their fragile peace for so long. But looking at Eva, at the raw, untainted curiosity in her eyes, Aris saw a ghost of her younger self, and the weight of that perpetual silence felt like a chain around her neck. To silence Eva was to admit that their victory had required them to become monsters of a different kind, forever pruning the tree of human knowledge to keep it from growing too tall. Yet to recruit her, to pull her into this shadow war, was to curse her with the same burden, to show her the prison and make her a warden. It was to repeat the cycle, creating another lonely sentinel in the dark. Could their protection of humanity ever be truly complete if it demanded the perpetual sacrifice of its brightest minds? The rain continued to fall, and in that moment, Aris held the future of human curiosity in her hands, poised to either extinguish its flame or condemn it to a lifetime of watching the shadows. The data felt like a loaded weapon in her hands. Aris projected Leo's encrypted files onto the wall of her cabin, the ghostly images of failed timelines flickering in the dim light. She showed Eva the cold, hard evidence of humanity's repeated descent into Chronovores, the inevitable transformation from explorer into predator. She watched the young physicist's face carefully, waiting for the terror, the denial, the revulsion that should have followed such a revelation. It never came. Eva's brow furrowed in intense concentration, her eyes scanning the cascading data with a clinical, almost detached focus. A grim determination settled over her features. "I see the pattern," she said, her voice steady and low. "The equations all suggest a critical stability threshold was crossed in every single instance." Her finger traced a graph showing the exponential spike in temporal energy consumption just before each catastrophic collapse. What if the problem was not time travel itself, Dr. Thorne, but our own psychological architecture? What if we are simply not built to handle that kind of power without a fundamental change to our own minds? The question hung in the air, a heresy against everything Aris had fought for. Then Eva offered the dangerous part, the spark of a terrifying new hope. What if we could build a safeguard, not a weapon but a governor? A psychological failsafe integrated directly into the technology, something that would prevent the user from ever developing the hunger in the first place. She was not talking about banning the power. She was talking about taming it, about solving the flaw in the pilot rather than grounding the aircraft forever. This was not the fearful retreat Aris had expected. It was a bold, terrifying advance, a proposal to fight the cancer of ambition with the medicine of enforced limitation. Could you truly build a cage for the human soul, one strong enough to hold back a god? The silence in the room was no longer just the absence of sound, but the quiet before a paradigm shifts, a fragile and dangerous hope taking its first tentative breath. The rain tapped a soft, insistent rhythm against the windowpane, the only sound in the heavy silence that followed Eva's proposal. Aris stared at the young physicist, the word safeguard echoing in her mind like a curse. "You are not talking about a governor for a machine," Aris finally said, her voice low and strained. "You are talking about rewiring the human mind itself." Eva's expression remained unwavering, a scientist confronted with a difficult but necessary equation. She called up a new schematic, a complex double helix model intertwined with shimmering energy fields. "It is a genetic modifier," she explained, her tone chillingly matter-of-fact. "It targets the neurological pathways associated with transcendent ambition and obsessive greed. It would not lower intelligence or dull creativity. It would simply remove the capacity for the hunger that turns us into them. The very traits that lead to corruption would be edited out of our species, like correcting a fatal flaw in our source code." The horror that washed over Aris was colder than any she had felt facing the Chronovores. Those were monsters from a possible future. This was a monster being proposed in the here and now. "You are talking about lobotomizing the human spirit to save it," Aris argued, the words tasting like ash. "You would strip away our drive, our passion to explore, our need to reach for the stars. Is a world without greed also a world without grand art, without impossible architecture, without the burning desire to push past every boundary we have ever known?" This was no longer a debate about physics. It was a philosophical war for the soul of their entire species. Eva met her gaze, her own conviction a wall of pure, terrifying logic. "What is the alternative?" she countered. "To remain forever in this cage, watching and waiting for the next curious mind to stumble toward the lock, or to risk repeating the cycle until one of those timelines does not have an Aris Thorne to stop it? This is not a lobotomy, it is a vaccine. We inoculate ourselves against our own worst nature." The choice was now terrifyingly clear. They could preserve humanity as it was, flawed, dangerous, and gloriously unpredictable, and accept the eternal risk of self-annihilation. Or they could create a safer, saner version of themselves, a humanity forever shielded from its own potential for godhood and damnation. Could a species that had willingly cut away its own ambition still call itself human? The price of absolute safety was beginning to look like a form of spiritual suicide. The debate hung in the air, a fragile bubble of moral crisis, when the old scanner on Aris' workbench flickered to life. It emitted a low, pinging sound, a weak but unmistakable heartbeat. A faint, familiar energy signature painted itself across the screen, a ghost of the original Chronovore breach they thought had been erased forever. But it wasn't an attack. The energy was contained, self-referential, coiled into a tiny, localized time bubble no larger than a marble, a perfect, stable paradox that had somehow drifted through the cracks of the healed timeline to find its way to her. It was not a weapon. It was a message in a bottle cast adrift from the heart of the storm. As the bubble stabilized on her scanner, it unfolded, releasing its payload not as a sound, but as a direct data stream into her system. Words formed on the screen, and a voice she had not heard in decades, weary and final, spoke from the other side of forever. It was Leo. The forbidden is not the travel, but the change, his message began, each word etched with the clarity of a man who had seen the absolute end of things. We were never meant to be authors, only readers. Tell them, make them understand. The simplicity of the statement was a hammer blow. It reframed everything. The danger was not the act of moving through time. It was the inherent, corrupting urge to edit it, to move through the past as a ghost, observing but never touching. That was one thing. But the moment you reached out to fix a single mistake, to erase a single regret, you assumed a power no mortal was ever meant to hold. You stopped reading the book of history and started tearing out the pages you did not like. The Chronovores were not the cause of the prohibition. They were the ultimate symptom, the end result of a species that could not resist the temptation to pick up the pen. Leo's final message was not just a warning, it was a philosophical key. It offered a third path, one that lay between Eva's terrifying genetic safeguard and Aris' desperate permanent silence. It suggested that the flaw was not in our technology or even in our minds, but in our fundamental relationship with history itself. We were meant to be its students, not its editors. The prohibition was not against a tool, but against a specific, catastrophic form of arrogance. Could humanity learn to be humble readers of a story they were not writing, or was the lure of the author's chair simply too powerful to resist? The echo from the past had delivered not a command, but a challenge. The stone was cool and rough beneath her fingers, a simple slab of granite set deep in the quiet of the mountain wilderness. Aris traced the names carved into its surface, each one a ghost from a war that had never officially been fought. Leo, Kalen, and so many others, lost across countless branching realities, all casualties of the same beautiful, terrible dream. Eva stood beside her, her youthful face now marked with the same solemn understanding. They had not chosen to bury the knowledge or to weaponize it. They had chosen to build a tomb for an idea and to become its permanent guardians. This memorial was not just for the lost, it was a promise to remember the cost. Their new purpose was not to enforce a law with silence or violence, but to teach a story. They would ensure the truth of the temporal wars was passed down, a living chronicle of the price of godhood. It would not be a dry commandment in a forgotten rulebook. It would be a lesson written in blood and paradox, a saga of ambition's fall, told with the chilling clarity of those who had witnessed the aftermath. They would become the teachers of the terrible truth, the weavers of a cautionary tale so potent, so emotionally resonant, that any future mind brilliant enough to unlock the door would first have to confront the ghosts waiting on the other side. The prohibition would not stand on the shaky ground of authority, but on the unassailable foundation of a shared, painful memory. Can a story told well enough truly be stronger than any law? Can the weight of a tragedy remembered hold back the tide of human curiosity? This was their gamble, their third path. They would not suppress the flame of discovery, but they would forever tend the smoke, a permanent reminder of the fire that once consumed entire realities. The door to time travel would remain closed, not because it was locked, but because everyone who approached it would know, in their bones, the screams that lay behind it.